The fortifications of Malta consist of a number of walled cities, citadels, forts, towers, batteries, redoubts, entrenchments and pillboxes. The fortifications were built over thousands of years, from around 1450 BC to the mid-20th century, and they're a result of the Maltese islands' strategic position and natural harbours, which have made them very desirable for various powers. The earliest known fortifications in Malta are defensive walls built around Bronze Age settlements. The Phoenicians, Romans and Byzantines built a number of defensive walls around important settlements, but very little remains of these survive today. By the late medieval period, the main fortifications on Malta were the Capitol Mdina, the Cittadella on Gozo, the Castrum Maris and a few coastal towers or lookout posts. The fortifications of Malta were greatly improved while the islands were ruled by the Order of St. John between 1530 and 1798. The Hospitallers built new bastion fortifications, such as the fortifications of Birgu and Valletta, and upgraded the medieval defences. By the end of the 18th century, Malta had extensive fortifications around the Grand Harbour and Mars Amsit, as well as a coastal defence system consisting of towers, batteries, redoubts and entrenchments. Following a brief French occupation, the islands fell under British rule in 1800. Between the 1870s to the 1900s, a number of polygonal forts and batteries were built around Malta's coastline and along the Great Fault. In the 1930s and 1940s, Fort Campbell, a series of pillboxes and a number of anti-aircraft batteries were constructed, and these were the last fortifications to be built in Malta. Malta's fortifications are considered to be among the best examples of military architecture anywhere in the world. Major General Whitworth Porter of the Royal Engineers called Malta the most powerful artificial fortress in the world, in his 1858 book A History of the Fortress of Malta. In his 1893 book The Story of Malta, Mathurine Murray Ballou wrote that, "There is not a more complete system of fortifications extant in any part of the world than the cordon of defensive structures at Malta." The British architect Quentin Hughes referred to Malta's fortifications as, for sheer concentration and majesty, quite unmatched, while judge and historian Giovanni Bonello said that, "Nowhere in the world are fortifications more extensive, more impressive, more outstanding than they are in Malta." Ancient and medieval fortifications. The first fortifications in Malta were built during the Bronze Age. At least 6 sites have been identified as possible fortified settlements. The best preserved of these is the village of Borgin Nardir, close to the modern town of Berzebugha. Around 1450 BC, the inhabitants of the village built a 4.5 meters high E-shaped bastion to bar access to their village. The wall was built facing inland, showing that the people living in the village were more afraid of attacks from the land than from the sea. In around 700 BC, the Phoenicians founded and fortified the city of Malath on one of the highest points of the island, far away from the sea. Eventually the city was taken over by the Roman Empire and it was renamed Melite. The city was again renamed Medina by the Arabs, which led to its present name Mdina. Its fortifications were modified a number of times over time, and although most were dismantled and rebuilt between the 16th and 18th centuries, some foundations of the ancient Punic Roman ramparts, as well as various medieval remains, were recently discovered during excavations. The Romans also built a number of round towers on the islands, and the remains of several of them have been found. It is possible that these were used as watchtowers, but some historians dispute this since their locations do not really make sense in defensive systems. According to al-Himyari, when the Arabs captured Malta in 870 AD, they besieged, captured, sacked and dismantled a fortress. By 1241, the Gran Castello or Cittadella on Gozo was definitely fortified, although a settlement on the hill had existed since the Bronze Age. The city's fortifications were improved over the years. and the northern walls of the city that still stand today were built around the 15th century by the Crown of Aragon. The Castrum Maris was built sometime in the Middle Ages. The castle definitely existed by the 13th century, and it was involved in the Battle of Malta of 1283. By the early 16th century, it belonged to the de Nava family. In the early 15th century, the local militia had a number of watch posts around the Maltese islands, and in some cases there might have been fortified coastal watchtowers at these posts. One of these towers is known to have been built at St Elmo Point on the Cyprus Peninsula by the Aragonese in 1488. Hospitaller fortifications. Harbour area in 1530. The Maltese islands along with the North African port city of Tripoli were given to the Order of St John by Emperor Charles V. The knights settled in the town of Birgu and made it their capital. Soon after their arrival, the order rebuilt the Castrum Maris, calling it Fort St Angelo. Later on, the entire town of Birgu began to be surrounded by new fortifications, in a similar style to the order's earlier defences in Rhodes. Birgu's land front was built by 1540. Following the attack of 1551, the order realized the need to build more defences. Two forts were built in 1552, Fort St Elmo at the tip of the Cyprus Peninsula, on the site of an Aragonese watchtower, and Fort St Michael on Isola. In 1553, a new fortified city began to be built around Fort St Michael, and it was named Sengli after the Grand Master who built it. In 1565, the Ottomans attacked again in the Great Siege of Malta. Fort St Elmo fell after fierce fighting, but the knights held out in Birgu and Sengli until her relief force arrived. By the end of the siege, most of the fortifications had been destroyed in the attacks, so they were rebuilt. The Grand Master, Jean Paraissot de Valletta, decided to build a new fortified capital on the Cyprus Peninsula. The first stone of the new city was laid down in 1566, and it was called Valletta. The city walls, which were constructed mainly in the 1560s and 1570s, remain largely intact to this day, and they include bastions, cavaliers, counterguards and a ditch. The ruined Fort St Elmo was rebuilt and integrated into the city walls. The area around St Elmo was strengthened a number of times later on in the 17th century, especially by the building of the Carafar Encinta in 1687. With the development of new technologies, by the 17th century it was realized that while Valletta's fortifications were well designed, they were not strong enough to withstand a heavy attack. Because of this, the Floriana lines, encircling Valletta's original land front, were built from 1635 to the 1640s. In the 18th century, a suburb developed between the Floriana lines and Valletta's land front, and it became known as Floriana, today a town in its own right. In 1638, the Santa Margherita lines began to be built encircling the land fronts of Birgu and Sengila. Works were suspended in 1645 due to a lack of funds, and they remained unfinished for many years. Following the fall of Candia to the Ottomans in 1669, a second line of fortifications, the Cotonera lines, began to be built encircling both Birgu and Sengli, as well as the unfinished Santa Margherita lines. They were begun in 1670, but works stopped in 1680 again due to a lack of funds. By this time, the Bastion d'Encinta had been built, although other crucial parts had not yet been constructed. Eventually, some effort was done to complete both the Santa Margherita and Cotonera lines in the early 18th century. Although some of the planned ravelins, cavaliers, ditch and other fortifications were never constructed. Fort San Salvatore was built on one of the Cotonera line's bastions in 1724. Fort Ricasoli was built between 1670 and 1698, commanding the eastern arm of the Grand Harbour. It has an irregular plan following the coastline, with bastions, curtains and ravelins. The fort was improved later on in the 18th century. Fort St Angelo was also extensively modified in the 1690s, when it was upgraded with the building of various batteries and other defences. From 1723 to 1733, Fort Manoel was built on Manoel Island in Marsamxett Harbour, so as to protect Valletta's western flank. The Baroque fort is square in shape, with four corner bastions. It was the last major fort to be built with the bastion trace in Malta. The Order's last major fortification in the harbour area was Fort Tyne, built at Tyne Point between 1793 and 1795. It was built to protect the entrance of Marsamxett, along with Fort St Elmo. The fort's architecture is very different from the Order's earlier forts, and although very small by 18th century standards, it has been described as among the most revolutionary and influential of Malta's fortifications, as it is a very early example of a polygonal fort. Many other polygonal forts were built by the British later on in the 19th century. Mdina and the Cittadella. Although Mdina was no longer the capital city, the Order still strengthened the city's defences, and gradually upgraded its medieval walls into a gunpowder fortress. In the 1540s, during the magistracy of Juan de Home de Suicoscan, two bastions were built on the corners of the city's land front. The central de Redon bastion was built by Grand Master Martin de Redon in the mid-17th century. The city was damaged during the 1693 Sicily earthquake, and repairs were made over the course of the 18th century. During the rebuilding, the city's entrance was replaced by a larger gate by the architect Charles-François de Mondian in 1724, and the last modifications were made in 1746, when Despuig Bastion was completed. There were other plans to strengthen the city, but these were not implemented as the Order focused on the fortifications at the harbour area. The defences of Gozzo's Cittadella were also improved by the Order. In 1551, the city was devastated by an Ottoman raid which took almost Gozzo's entire population as slaves. The city's entrance and southern walls were later completely rebuilt between 1599 and 1622, although the city's northern walls were retained in their original medieval form. The early 17th century modifications included the construction of bastions, cavaliers, magazines and a battery. Coastal fortifications. Despite the significant fortifications in the harbour area, the rest of the islands remained mostly undefended until the 17th century, and they were prone to attacks. This changed in 1605, when Gozzo's Tower was built in Mgarr on the island of Gozzo. This watchtower no longer exists as it was demolished by the British administration in 1848. In the following years, more towers were built around the islands. The first group, the Wynyack Court Towers, were built between 1610 and 1620. 6 of these were built, and they were more than just watchtowers, as they formed significant strongpoints intended to protect vulnerable sections of the coast from attack. Of the 6 towers, one collapsed in around 1715 and another was demolished in 1888. The other 4 towers survive to this day. 7 more towers were built between 1637 and 1638. These were much smaller than the Wynyack Court Towers, as they were built as watchtowers and a communication link to warn the Order's base in the Grand Harbour of an attack. In 1647, St Agatha's Tower was built in Maliha. This was a large tower intended as a strongpoint, and was built in the style of the Wynyack Court Towers. 2 more towers were built at Tuidra and Exlender on Gozzo in 1650 and 1652. The 10 towers built between 1637 and 1652 are collectively known as the Lascaris Towers after the Grand Master who built them, and 9 of them survive to this day. Another series of towers were built between 1658 and 1659. 14 towers were built in all, which are together known as the de Redon Towers. These were based on the Lascaris Towers and had the same function as a communication link. 13 towers were built on mainland Malta having an identical design, and 8 of these survive intact while 2 are in ruins. The 14th tower, Mgarrx Tower, was built on Gozo in 1661 with a slightly different design. The last coastal watchtower to be built was Isapu Tower, which was constructed in Gozo in 1667. The tower had almost collapsed but was rebuilt in the early 2000s and it is now in good condition. From 1714 onwards, about 52 batteries and redoubts were built around the coasts of Malta and Gozo. A few of the batteries were built around existing coastal watchtowers, such as Quora and Arax towers. Most of the batteries were destroyed over the years or are in ruins, but a few are still more or less intact, including Mistra, Vendome, Ferretti, St. Antony's, Ola El Bajda and St. Mary's batteries. Very few redoubts survive, including Briconet, Ximenez and St. George redoubts. Various entrenchments were also built over the years around Malta's coastline, and the remains of a few survive. From 1749 to the 1760s, Fort Chambray was built on the island of Gozo. It was intended to be a new fortified city like Valletta, and eventually to replace the Cittadella as the island's capital. This was unsuccessful, and eventually only the fort was built. It saw some action during the French occupation of 1798, but its importance eventually diminished. It was converted into a hospital in the 19th century. In the 1990s, the interior of the fort began to be redeveloped, but the outer bastions and some barracks remain intact. Between 1793 and 1795, St Lucian Tower and its battery were strengthened with a ditch and an entrenchment-like enclosure, and the complex was renamed Fort Rowan after the reigning Grand Master, Emmanuel de Rohan Polduc. Most of the fortifications, with the exception of the tower itself, were dismantled and rebuilt by the British later on in the 19th century, and the name Fort Rowan fell into disuse. Apart from the knights' fortifications, over the years various individuals or families built their own fortifications. These were mainly fortified residences or private watchtowers. A notable surviving example is Mamo Tower, built in 1657 in Marsashkala. French occupation. The French evicted the order from Malta during the Mediterranean campaign of 1798, and the order surrendered after a couple of days. The Maltese, although initially welcoming the French occupiers, rebelled after a couple of months due to a number of reforms and the looting of churches. The insurgents took control of Gozo, which became briefly independent, as well as Mdina and the towns and villages of the main island, leaving the French blockaded in the well-defended harbour area. The Maltese insurgents, helped by the British, hastily built various fortifications mainly intended to repel a possible French counter-attack, and at the same time also bombard French positions in the harbour area. The insurgents had various camps, and men in these camps were responsible for a number of batteries, redoubts and entrenchments in the vicinity. The most important batteries were the Corradino batteries, Rocco Battery, Talborg Battery and Tas Samra Battery. The fortifications surrounded the entire harbour area, stretching all the way from Slima to Kalkara. The design of the batteries was based on the coastal batteries and entrenchments built by the order in the 18th century. While most of the entrenchments consisted of long stretches of rubble walls, they were armed by guns taken from coastal fortifications such as St Mary's Tower. The usefulness of the fortifications was tested in 1799 when a French counter-attack from Fort Manoel was repelled by the insurgent batteries. None of these fortifications survive intact, although some pre-existing buildings that were used as blockhouses may still be seen. San Rocco Battery, one of the insurgents' fortifications, was the location where Fort St Rocco was built later on in the late 19th century.